Hello ladies and gentlemen, Willie here. This is the second part of my look into how Wrath of the Lich King changed World of Warcraft as a whole. If you haven't, go and check out part 1 first. It covers a bunch of subjects that won't be in this video, just so I don't repeat myself. I'll link it down below. Also, consider dropping me a sub if you do enjoy the content, it really helps me out. Let's get into it then. We have a lot left to talk about: raids, more expansion features, and the negatives that you can take from Wrath of the Lich King. You know what Blizzard decided World of Warcraft was missing in Wrath? What we also desperately needed during our assault on the Scourge in the Frozen North? A feature that was pretty much pushed in every single area of the game that it could be? Vehicle combat! Woo! Strand of the Ancients, Wintergrasp Eye of Eternity, the Oculus Dungeon Flame Leviathan, as well as it being a more frequent occurrence during questing. Someone at Blizzard really liked the idea of vehicles when players historically don't. Not at all, really. It's one of those things like underwater content. It's a cool idea, it's worth trying, but most people already aren't going to like it regardless. Why? Because it's a change from the normal. Remember Terran Gorfiend from Black Temple? That fight where you got a couple extra action buttons and some people just lost their mind? Same deal here. People mostly just like their class and how their class plays, even if the buttons on the vehicle are as single target attack and AoE attack, let alone adding some complexity. I remember people avoiding the Oculus dungeon like the plague during Wrath of the Lich King, and I never really understood it. Always remember just taking a couple red drakes and a green one and you could blast through it in about 10 minutes. In fact, it ended up being one of the shortest dungeons there was. Vehicle combat was pushed super hard in Wrath of the Lich King, and I never really remember too much praise for it myself. I wasn't really jumping at the thought of hopping into a vehicle instead of just playing my class, but if someone had to do it, sure, I'll do it. Anywho, speaking of dungeons, they changed big time from TBC. In the Burning Crusade we had normal and heroic dungeons. Now the normals, just as they were in Wrath of the Lich King, were more for leveling than anything else. The heroics were for starter level endgame gear. The TBC heroics were brutal and also needed a key or an achievement to be done before you were able to get inside. The Wrath of the Lich King heroics were a joke difficulty wise. You really had to mess up in order to cause a wipe. Blizzard had toned down the dungeons to such a massive extent. I remember the 3 dungeons released later on in the expansion, being the Pit of Sauron, Forge of Souls and Halls of Reflection, actually having a decent spike in difficulty comparatively, but the early ones, a far cry from the difficulty that used to be associated with the word heroic. Perhaps dungeons though had to be easier due to another expansion feature, and undoubtedly one of the most criticised ones at that. You may know what I'm talking about, and we're going to save that one for a bit later on, okay? But by and large, I still liked the dungeons, especially how they often lined up with questing as an end of zone goal with a bunch of quests in there. Apart from that one event in the Halls of Stone with Bran Bronzebeard, whatever happened to him, by the way? That took forever, that one was the worst. Other than that, dungeons, good. Which brings us to raids, often the best part of any expansion in my opinion, the reason why so many of us have gotten into WoW over the years. And I suppose I should mention that raiding was split in Wrath of the Lich King. In BC it was 10-man Kara and ZA and 25 in all other raids. Wrath introduced 10 and 25-man raiding, both on separate lockouts. Many 10-man guilds started to pop up all over the place. Organising 10 people is just easier than 25 after all, but this created a divide. Why would you even do a 25-man raid when 10 is so much more accessible? Loot. Better loot is why, and the 25-mans could easily drop into a 10-man and separate their groups to double the amount of loot they could get per week, whereas the 10-man guilds pretty much always had to pug if they wanted that step up. This was another attempt by Blizzard just to get more people into raiding and make it accessible. I'm going to be using that word a lot, by the way, because Wrath introduced many aspects to support it. This would be one of the key complaints of the 10-man raids going forwards. They just couldn't get as good gear. Well, it would be until eventually in Mists of Pandaria, Blizzard revamped the system as a whole, giving us flexible, normal and heroic, and then mythic. Raids in Wrath of the Lich King, as touched in on part 1 of this look back, were turbulent, shall we say. Each new tier went through a change in how they worked. Blizzard wanted 2 things to be completed with raids this expansion. 1 for people to be actually able to see the raids as newer or less skilled players, and 2 for the top end players to have a challenge waiting for them. They wanted bosses to be rock solid walls that needed hours and hours, and hundreds of attempts to break down. This would be a labour spanning the whole expansion. Let's start with the first set of raids in Wrath of the Lich King. We had revamped Naxxramas, Eye of Eternity, and Sothurian's Lair. Okay, we had Vault of Archivon too, but did you ever even do that place in a non-pug? It was a loot pinata with more pinatas added on as we progressed through the expansion. Have a guess at what day the first kill on 25-man Kel'Thuzad was in Wrath of the Lich King. As a reminder, the expansion released on November 13th. Go on, pick something that sounds silly, just for the fun of it. Done? Well, if you said November 15th, you're correct. Yes, 2 days after Wrath is out, KT is down. 2 days. 2. How about Malygos and the Eye of Eternity, the aspect of magic himself? Also November 15th. Safarian? You already know, November 15th. The whole first raid tier was cleared in 2 days from launch. This was unprecedented. Blizzard turned the difficulty dial so far down it was insane, and these guilds were clearing places in quest screens still. Sure, they were great players, but in the days to come, dozens and dozens of additional guilds landed their first clears on all the content. It was clear it was just undertuned, and this was a big shocker for Blizzard of course. Raiding is so key to WoW. If the top end players don't have a challenge, well, they're not really going to be sticking around for anything but PvP, and whilst this did allow newer players to get into raiding, it just wasn't a healthy balance overall. The issue of how we can keep both crowds happy started to crop up. And you may be saying, hold on now, the real difficulty in the early tiers were from all the achievements. Some of them were hard, sure, but the speed kill on Malygos, or bringing a few less players for Nax or Eye of Eternity, wasn't really much of a hurdle to overcome when the content itself was just undertuned. The Undying from Naxxramas, awesome achievement, but it really boiled down to Vesuvius first, go straight to Thaddeus, and then hope your mages don't troll on Sapphiron. Anyone had a dodgy connection or somewhat unreliable? Just have them stand out of the fight. You hardly needed a full squad to take this on. Sotharian's Lure-free Drakes was the real deal though, especially early on in the expansion, I'll give you that, and was actually seen as one of the most challenging bits of content for the entirety of Wrath of the Lich King. Our next tier of raiding tried something new, and something that I feel might have been the solution to the problem of accessibility in raiding, but wasn't continued moving forwards, which I think is a real shame. And this raid was one of the most memorable and well-liked raids to ever exist in WoW. On April 15th, 2008, the gates of Ulduar opened, a Titan facility and the prison of an old god. This place was completely epic. Just the scale of the place in total was mind-blowing. The first encounter was completely unique. Sure, it was vehicle combat again, but it felt like a battle. You're breaking into this zone closed off for so long for the first time. And Ulduar just has so many memorable bosses. Flame Leviathan, XT, the crazy cat lady and her death scream that completely destroys your ears, Freya, Mimiron, Thorim, Hodia, Algalon and Yogg-Saron himself. This place was massive. It was a 14 boss raid. And the change that introduced coming from the first tier was hard mode, and unfortunately it was the only time we ever saw this mechanic in WoW. Hard mode and heroic modes are two different things. Heroic is turned on before you enter the raid. Hard mode is a modification to a boss encounter during the raid by taking certain actions, such as activating the towers on Flame Leviathan, destroying the heart on XT, leaving elders up on Freya, the big red button on Mimiron for Firefighter, and Yogg-Zero Keepers, Alone in the Darkness for example. All topped off with a hard mode to end all hard modes, Algalon the Observer.
Citizens of Dalaran, raise your eyes to the skies and observe.
Okay, no, stop. We've all heard that line enough now, but hearing that back in Wrath of the Lich King, some guild just pulled off a massive feat. It even had an achievement for it to get a key, something that was also largely lost from TBC. They weren't really a thing anymore, and the achievement itself involved beating pretty much every other boss with a hard mode on hard mode. And a kill on Algalon wasn't achieved until about a month after the raid had released. He hit like a truck made out of other trucks, and had many mechanics that instantly wiped the raid. The enrage was a tight 8 minutes, and to top it all off, he despawned after 1 hour. In fact, the first kill was on May 18th by Ensidia, the next wasn't until May 27th by Apathy. This was the difficulty for the top end players. Blizzard had brought back a challenge to the raiding scene in such a monumentally great way that Ulduar is now remembered as the jewel in the crown of Blizzard's competence of creating consistently fantastic raids. And hard mode was such an elegant solution to the problem of difficulty. In just one raid, one lockout, got a solid group, you can try some hard modes. If you're bringing along some new guys, just do normal instead. It was great, and this honestly seemed like Blizzard had cracked the code. The only issue left was the 25 and 10 man divide. Which brought us on to the next raid tier, which was kind of a bit of a downwards turn, shall we say, coming from Ulduar. And the next raid was Trial of the Crusader. This once again changed the raiding system. Hard mode was left in the dust and we got heroic for the first time instead. A new format similar to how dungeons worked, just toggle the difficulty before entering the raid and a job done. It also introduced attempts. Each week you were given 50 attempts. So after 50 wipes, the remainder of the bosses despawn, and your progress for the week is over. Loot from the final boss, Anubarak, is also improved based upon attempts left. This attempt system would be experimented with for Icecrown Citadel. Imagine the race to world first streams if this was still a thing as well. Heroic would be a mainstay for some time. Trial of the Crusader had its own legacy for various reasons. I think the main issue people had with the raid was you're just in the same room for hours and hours. People like a change of scenery. What it did do, however, was present some of the toughest and hardest achievements to ever have been put in the game. You barely ever see any of the rewards from this raid, and there's a good reason for that. Let's take a look at Realm First Grand Crusader, giving the Grand Crusader title. Beat every boss in Trial of the Grand Crusader without wiping first on your realm. You can die, but one wipe and it's over. Funnily enough, the attempt system was removed in Cataclysm, so people actually went back and were still able to complete this, wiping as much as they wanted if no guild ever claimed it back then. A tribute to dedicated insanity, this rewarded the Argent Defender title. Complete Trial of the Grand Crusader 10-man without wiping, and with no player using an item earned from Trial of the Grand Crusader 25 or better. Sound hard? How about this one then? A tribute to immortality. Complete Trial of the Grand Crusader 25-man without anyone dying, and this earned the Crusader's Warhorse. These were some big boy achievements, especially when the last boss, Anubarak, had Leeching Swarm, which drained 30% of current health every second. To put it in perspective, World First was 3 months after the raid came out for this achievement. The next 2 clears each came a month apart. Only 3 guilds got this in 2009 when the raid came out in August. These achievements were down to the wire and extremely difficult to earn. If you had any of these from back in the day, it's a badge of prestige. The thing was with Trial of the Crusader, apart from being a room for most of the raid, heroic mode was on a separate lockout from normal, and you want to get as much loot as possible for your raid, right? This meant that guilds would do 4 lockouts a week, normal 10 and 25, and then heroic 10 and 25. It was all a bit much to be doing from week to week, and you bet people will do everything possible to get the best loot. Despite this, I thought the bosses themselves were really good. I even liked the faction champions fight. It was an interesting idea, but Trial of the Crusader was a lead up to the big tier, the fight we'd all been waiting for in Icecrown Citadel. ICC shook up the raid format once again, and you may think it was just heroic like Trial of the Crusader, and well, it kind of was. It was like that and sort of how Sunwell went, with different areas of the raid released after a period of time. The first tier up to Sourfang was on the 8th of December 2009, and the final tier with the Lich King himself was on the 2nd of February 2010. Also, each final boss of the tier had an attempt system too, those being Putricide, Lanathel, Sindragosa, and the Lich King. Once you're out of attempts, these bosses despawn. Early on, raiders had as few as 5 attempts, but this grew week on week, and this was the time when we went into fights blind. This is why a kill on the Lich King took just under 2 months to complete. It also gave us the legendary kill video by Paragon, and I'm going to link it below. It's such a good watch, I'd recommend it. Raiding was at such a peak at this point in time, and there was also a reinforcement system linked to the reputation, the Ashen Verdict, that buffed up players more and more to give them extra damage, healing, and less damage taken, I believe, as time went on. There was the challenge for the top-end raiders, there was accessibility for the newer guys and pugging players. Everyone was getting what they wanted and being able to step foot and see some of this fantastic raid. Oh, and there was the revamped Onyxia fight and Ruby Sanctum. Not really too much to say about these. Ruby Sanctum feels so forgettable, it was just in the shadow of Icecrown. A bit of content to tie us over to waiting for the next expansion, though ICC would be hard to beat whatever Blizzard delivered next. Somehow though, I've only covered one part of the content I wanted to do in this video so far. It just warrants that level of information, I feel. Anyway, let's move on from raiding to talk about PvP. PvP changed big time in Wrath. It really started to grow, and for many people it was the peak. Arenas became so much more competitive. Classes by and large all had pretty good skill caps. Legends were made, people still streaming today who uploaded in Warcraft movies back then, likes of Hydra, Zico, Venruki, Rekful and so on. We got new arenas too, the Dalaran sewers to add to the pool that we already have, as well as the Ring of Valor, which was eventually removed due to bugs. A new battleground, Strand of the Ancients, which had a big focus on vehicle combat, and I'm just gonna say it, I was never a fan of Strand personally. Whenever I hit random BG and I was in Strand, I wasn't exactly over the moon. There were some very memorable classes in Arena back then for sure, Elemental Shamans and the power of Lava Burst, Destruction Warlocks with Chaos Bolt, Rogues that could just spam an AoE interrupt, Prot Holy Paladins that if ever got one cast off would instantly be at full health, the utter insanity of DK Ret in 2v2, TSG in 3s, DK Warriors and Paladins, Spell Cleaves, Beast Cleaves, double BM Hunters with Readiness, the list goes on and on. Blizzard also tried to bring back World PvP that people had been ever so critical of losing since flying had become a thing, and they did this in the form of Battle for Wintergrasp. Every 2.5 hours the battle starts. It's a huge zone, once again focused around vehicle combat mainly. The defending faction must hold out for 30 minutes, whilst the attackers have access to a wide variety of siege weapons at their disposal. I actually really like Wintergrasp, which sort of doesn't make sense since I didn't like Strand of the Ancients, but it makes sense to me, so there we go. There were also elementals that spawned that made it an interesting action for people looking to farm some gold there. The winning side would have easy access to Vault of Archivon and the Loot Pinata bosses in there that dropped PvE and PvP tier. Some really good gear actually, as well as the 2-seater Mammoth mount, which I just happened to be the proud owner of, winning it back in the day. All in all, not too much groundbreaking content to cover with PvP. It was much just an evolution onwards from TBC, but it was a good time to be into it for sure. So let's get back to expansion features now. I've touched on it a number of times already, but achievements were brought into the game. Well, they were technically in the Wrath pre-patch, but still, a new way for you to stand out from the crowd and prove how awesome you are. Not only that, but they added new incentivizations for Blizzard to add content on top of content. What I mean by this is the likes of things like meta achievements, Glory of the Hero awarding a mount for all dungeon stuff, Glory of the Raider for each new raid tier giving titles or mounts. It gave a good solo content as well, collections, kills, questing, rep farming, or just playing the game in general. You got extra rewards, and there was a massive number of achievements. There was also the statistics panel, so you can find out, well, all kinds of things. Need to know how many flight paths you've taken, how many times you've done a /lol emote, the game's got you covered. Also, being able to link professions in chat was now a thing. It was there for all to see. This led to players getting used to people needing to prove they had experience, which led to other things down the line, shall we say, which we'll talk about in a moment. The sheer amount of convenience factors that were brought in with Wrath of the Lich King cannot be understated. Things that just made sense to exist, especially in an ever-growing and expanding game. The equipment manager allowing you to swap between item sets easily, a wonderful addition. Removing something tedious is always great. We had new bank tabs added for the likes of currencies and pets, amongst other things. Great. Collecting was growing as a more and more popular form of gameplay for World of Warcraft, and those bag spaces at this point were really hurting. Having to make choices of what goes and stays was becoming more and more tough, and this extra space allowed the collection enthusiasts to indulge in the content that they enjoyed more freely. Heirlooms were introduced in Wrath of the Lich King. These were pieces of armor you could buy that boost your XP gained up to the current expansion's content, and at this point in WoW it was up to 80 levels already, so that was a sizable amount of content. Heirlooms made checking out alts a bit more attractive. Back then when they were account bound though, so you had to keep trading them around. Nowadays the system makes more sense as heirlooms have their own collection log, so they're all in one place and you don't have to sift through finding out where a particular item is hidden on your many characters. Dual specialization came in Wrath of the Lich King. The age-old gripe of the sheer cost of changing specialization was finally done away with. You could have your raid spec and your PvP spec without having to farm and farm gold like a madman for the privilege of doing so, though the dual specialization itself did have an upfront cost of 1,000 gold. I like specialization identity, but there is also a part of me that likes to try new things, and being able to play a fully efficient specialization for the activity that I'm doing, and the paywall honestly just wasn't a good way of restricting that in my opinion, or at least not to the extent of the amount that it cost. Perhaps the most important feature of the whole expansion though, the barber shop. How had this taken over 3 years to implement into the game? Who knows, an oversight perhaps, but finally your character could change up their look a little bit. Race changing in the shop was also brought in Wrath of the Lich King as another feature. The amount of new things that just made sense and made the game feel better to play. Not easier, just better. It was a time when accessibility was the key word, and Blizzard added much to make quality of life changes that made sense now more so than in previous expansions. Wrath of the Lich King answered so many questions that people had been asking for such a long time. It's no wonder it was such a roaring success. But however, looking back to Wrath, it certainly changed the game in a way many people consider negative, despite all the good points I've just gone over. Let's talk about the not so good stuff now. Ever heard the term Wrath babies? Basically somebody who started WoW in Wrath and wasn't there for the real expansions, in inverted commas there. They were playing the easy version of the game. They couldn't possibly appreciate how hardcore life was back in vanilla and TBC. Your classic internet gatekeeping basically, usual stuff. The thing is, it was easier, a lot easier. Remember I'll talk about the first raid tier and heroic dungeons? They were absolutely face roll material, but for some people they weren't. Enter LFG. Patch 3.3, looking for group dungeon finder, an automated way at the click of a button to find 4 other people to go through some dungeons with, either whilst leveling or for heroic at level cap. No longer was the need to run to the dungeon entrance to look for players or indeed interact at all really once you got going. As soon as 4 other people were there, off you went. And this got a lot of people who just didn't do PvE or anything group related into PvE and group related stuff, and well, let's just say there was an exceptional number of people who for them, Wrath of the Lich King heroics were a serious challenge, being matched with people who were running their daily heroic for badges, a clash between people who are capable of blasting through dungeons in 10 to 15 minutes and people who associated the word heroic with a serious challenge, or maybe are just playing WoW for the first time ever. It created a massive amount of toxicity between the two groups and went a long way to shape the long-lasting resentment against more casual players who up to this point in time had been seen and not heard. LFG in the eyes of some players was great though. Which players were those? Tanks, pretty much. Since the dawn of time in Azeroth till today in Battle for Azeroth, tanks are the hardest class to find. Instant tank queues were so nice, and if you're competent tanking or gearing an ult, you could really carry hard, even a bad group through dungeons. It was actually such a nice time to play a tank when compared to DPS with their 30-minute plus queues. So I just mentioned doing your heroic dailies for emblems. Enter big criticism number 2 for Wrath. Emblem or badge gear, whatever you want to call it. Basically, I'll make it real simple. Each new tier was a hard reset on gear more or less. Gear from emblems was really good, and everyone had an easy access to getting emblems. In the eyes of some, casual players were able to get mega geared and felt as though their hard work and raid clears has been for naught when each new patch. Stuff you can get from a vendor was of super high quality. This was another factor that made alts attractive too, by the way. This was a real push towards catch-up gear. You didn't have to play from day one and progress in a linear fashion through raids. Leave the game at Naxxramas and come back at ICC? Well, Emblem Gear is your best friend and will get you back up to speed and ready to raid pretty fast. Honestly, I don't see the harm in all this at all. You know why? Because if more people are gearing, more people are raiding, more people are doing dungeons. If you lose a tank, you aren't going to have to spend weeks and weeks gearing up another. It's so much more streamlined and allowed players to enjoy the game whenever they came back. Remember how people started wanting proof before they'd invite you? The age-old tale of link achievement before I'll invite you to the raid, but you have to have completed the raid before you can get an invite. How'd you get an invite? Just complete the raid. And even back then there were add-ons developed, so you just entered a date on it and faked it. I remember using my alts to get invites all the time. But that wasn't enough. Oh no, we need more hurdles to overcome. Notice how items on them have an item level on them. You could tally them up into a total number, a score, a gear score you could say. The gear score add-on. The idea is simple, the better your gear, the higher level it will have. Now you needed to link an achievement and your gear score for invites. People who usually had no access to gear were getting gear through emblems and LFG. Suddenly people started a frantic need to try and filter out people based upon all and any criteria possible, and gear score was a part of that. In fact, funnily enough, Blizzard adapted gear score into the game now in Battle for Azeroth, and it's used much to the same effect. Finally, things just being easier. The first raid tier, heroic dungeons, or the accessibility that people took as catering to more casual friendly players, the final bastion of the self-proclaimed hardcore elite had been broken down, the gate shattered and the dam breached, and the expansion was so much better for it. Wrath of the Lich King was the peak. Subscriptions never got higher ever again, and I know this is a big word to say, but I don't think they ever will. The legacy of Arthas being the key selling point made it a great thing to get started in and a pleasure to play all the way through. Every aspect of the game was buzzing, and I'm very hopeful of a Blizzard sanctioned server to take me there again one day. The tail end of Wrath of the Lich King was once again lengthy. ICC felt you just beat the game, to be honest. Ruby Sanctum was a real surprise, and the wait, just like TBC to Wrath of the Lich King, was very long. Patch 3.3 and ICC was December 2009, and what came next was July 2010. The follow-up to Wrath of the Lich King had so much to live up to. No matter what Blizzard did, it was going to be a tall ask, and their project for the next chapter of Azeroth was extremely ambitious. A full world revamp. Many big class changes and a big new villain on our screen. So join me next time as we take the next chapter in World of Warcraft's history and find out, how did the Cataclysm change World of Warcraft? If you like what you see, give the video a like and subscribe as there's plenty more to come. As always, thank you all so much for watching. Take care. Bye.